This time on Sensing the Signal. In this episode we're talking about the Defence Investment Plan, and we actually recorded the conversation between Chris and myself the day before the plan was actually published. We were actually in a studio about a mile away from where it was being finalised in Whitehall. We weren't privy to that, obviously, but since it's been released, we thought we would come back, record some extra content on the end of this episode to where we talk about our thoughts on the plan itself and whether it matched up to the discussion we had where we talked about what we would like to see in the Defence Investment Plan. So let's have a listen. On this episode of Sensing the Signal, we're going to be talking about the UK's Defence Industrial Plan, or Defence Investment Plan, and what it means for industry and what it means for defence generally, because it's been a pretty big story. And I'm joined by Chris, my colleague.
Hello.
Hey, Chris. This has been, well, in terms of UK politics, which might not mean as much outside the UK, but actually I think there are some knock-on consequences elsewhere, but it's been fairly seismic in the sense that, you know, we're a year on from the UK's Strategic Defence Review, which had a whole raft of recommendations, I think over 60 recommendations in total, had lots of aims that it set out to achieve for the UK. And that was all meant to be put into action by the Defence Investment Plan, which was due to come out in autumn. Yep. We still haven't seen. The Defence Secretary, John Healey, resigned over this in the sense that, you know, his take on it was that there wasn't enough budget being allocated to defence.
Yep.
My take on it is that was then the sort of key moment that probably pushed the Prime Minister towards resignation as well.
Yeah, it certainly hurt him.
I mean, yeah, that was maybe something that would have happened anyway, but I think definitely didn't help with John Healey going. So we've now got a new Secretary of Defence. We've got potentially a new Prime Minister coming in soon. And we're a week out, as we're talking today, we're a week out from the NATO summit, which is when the government has said they're going to push this plan out. We don't know what's in it yet. We're waiting to hear. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And I think what can the UK do with its defence budget, and what should it be doing, I suppose, and what do we want to see in that defence investment plan when it comes out? So, you know, immediate thoughts.
I think it's. I do have some opinions on the Defence Secretary leaving at this moment, because I just find it really hard to believe that a budget that I think is currently sat at around 2.3% GDP, there was a promise in the Strategic Defence Review of that being 2.5% by 2027. We're not at 2027 yet, and he's already getting upset about it. I think there was some indication that it was probably not going to be quite as much. We'd probably only get to, say, 2.6% instead of 3% by 2030, etc. But this is, you know, we're talking about a budget that's been historically, over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, in the region of 55 to 65 billion pounds. 0.1% equates to about £3 billion. So we're talking about a big argument over 9 billion, which, don't get me wrong, is a big number. But it's, you know, there's still a lot of the budget that's still there, could still be used, and was still within John Healey's purview to do something about and to improve. And I think there is a lot of efficiencies that could have been gained. We're dealing with a civil service that we know is bloated, ambivalent in a lot of ways. We've dealt with a lot of that.
There are some good people there. Let's
yeah, for sure. Like,
we know many. We know many, but yeah.
But there's work to be done to improve the efficiency of the civil service and the way that it procures. So I think to align all of the failings of defence to an argument over 0.3% of a budget, I think, is slightly distracting from what is a much bigger concern. And I think my initial response is, this is really difficult. This is incredibly difficult. Like, what exactly should you be spending your money on right now? This is a constantly changing environment. And one thing that I did see very clearly in that Strategic Defence Review from Keir Starmer was, this is what we're aiming for if the budget allows. And John Healey acknowledged that in his forward in the same document, saying, if allowed, this is what we're aiming for. So
And a lot's changed in the last 12 months.
So the whole Iran situation happened after that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some good reason why the Treasury and why Keir Starmer may have been reluctant to just push out and press ahead with those same promises. I also think that pressing ahead with that budget anyway isn't necessarily the right move if it's not spent on the right things. And I think that's what we can probably talk about today is what, in our humble opinions, we think it could be spent on.
Yeah.
So I think overall, if somebody said to me, hey, you've got a budget of 2.3, 2.5% to work with, I don't think I'd be complaining that it wasn't 2.7 or 3. I think I'd be just making the best of what I had. So I am a little bit disappointed that he did leave over this. And I do think it distracts from the real issue, which is what are we spending it on and how are we finding opportunities to make it more efficient? And I think that would have had a much bigger impact than arguing over 0.3%.
Yeah, and it's almost made it a narrative that's a headline narrative.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was partly what he had in mind because, you and I were talking about this before, but and you said, well, they were trying to push this out quietly on a Friday, the new defence investment plan, and it was not going to be a headline story. It was going to be something that was sort of almost snuck out.
Yeah.
And now they can't avoid it. The government can't avoid it being a big news story, and so it feels almost like they are now drip feeding us details each day about new things that are going to be in it to get people excited, maybe, or at least talk about some of the things that they are going to be focusing on. So talking about the things they are going to be buying rather than the things they're not going to be buying. Yeah. And where they are spending money. So I think absolutely we should. I'm keen for us to talk about what we want to see in that defence investment plan, and also I guess with the thought that how can defence be more creative with its budget? That's what I'm kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think creativity is really important because if you just rush ahead and acknowledge that you're going to spend more money, you're more likely to spend that money on the same primes, on the same kind of scenarios that we've spent it on in the past. People being very good at winning these contracts and maybe not as good at delivering always, and then us getting disappointed further down the line. What are we doing to bring lots of fresh talent into this arena? And I don't think that's just money. And the Strategic Defence Review did point at working alongside private investors to try and encourage that space. But I don't think this is just about investment either. I think this is about infrastructure. And bringing it back to what Katrina said in one of our previous podcasts and what you were talking about recently about clusters, I think we have to create environments that allow smaller businesses to flourish. And that means, in my view, that means infrastructure. So are we creating, have we got a decent AI infrastructure? Do we have data centers with spare capacity? Do we have cheap energy? Do we have access to engineering facilities that can quickly mock up different prototypes? Do we have access to, it might not be the best microchips in the world, but do we have access to good enough microchips for us to test and develop and do these fast turnarounds? We talked in the last podcast with Katrina about Shenzhen.
Yeah, and for anyone, just before you mention that, and for anyone who hasn't listened to that, I fully recommend they do go back and listen to it. So, we had a great conversation with Katarina Bondar from CSIS in Washington about Russian military capability development and how it's reflecting what's already happened in Ukraine, which we also spoke to her about on another episode previously. And, she's done a lot of research on, I guess, what's at the cutting edge of technology development in defence. Yeah,
exactly that. And I think that, we asked, one of the questions I asked her at the end was, if you were to, what should we measure in order to show that our defence is being successful? And her recommendation was that we should be measuring the cost of our equipment compared to that of our adversaries. And we see that, that's such a really obvious thing to do in today's warfare, which is, we're using multi-million-pound missiles to provide air defence against a £50,000 Shahed drone. So we have to close that gap. And I don't think we close that gap by just pouring more money into big primes. I think we close that gap by creating, and this is actually in the SDR, which is this whole society approach. And I think part of that whole society approach is you need an energy infrastructure, you need a data infrastructure, you need an engineering infrastructure, you need people that can come along and just use these facilities cheaply, very readily accessible, so that they can develop and identify new things. And then you need the investment and the procurement.
So it's about encouraging and incubating innovation in a way that's more effective, right? Because I think up to now we've seen it before where, you can go out and get innovation funding from various different government programs. And there was talk in the SDR about expanding that and putting more money towards innovation for small and medium-sized enterprises and trying to bring more SMEs into the defence space. But I think there's always still been that they've never quite given us a bridge across that valley of death for a lot of companies.
No.
So they'll have that initial funding, but it doesn't always lead on to programs of record.
No.
Or there's not an easy pathway towards those programs of record that means that innovation, initial kind of proof of concept or whatever it might be, is actually worthwhile.
400 million is their entire defence innovation proposal in the SDR.
Yeah.
Compared to...
Which at the time sounded great because it was more than before.
Yeah, it sounds a lot. But I think if you look at it through that lens of all of the infrastructure and how you want to integrate into society and in engineering and elsewhere, in Atreides we know better than anyone else what data costs to process and the phenomenal bill that is, because at the moment we're paying prime rates to AWS or Azure or to Oracle, to a whole list of these big prime companies, and we're not getting it. We're not getting any discount. We're not getting any access to privileged resources. There's no reason in the UK or access to do that more cheaply and allow smaller companies to access big data sources and do something with that. And looking at, we talk about how we want to integrate hybrid platforms. There's the targeting platform that they want to bring in as part of the defence review.
Yeah, the digital targeting web.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of that, what we should be doing, in my view, right now is collecting all the data from the drones that are in operational space and then figuring out what to do with it later and what lessons can we learn from what the data that is being emitted or captured by these drones as they're going out and being operational. It's the understanding of that data that will lead to the innovation later. But that is phenomenally expensive if we're going to keep doing this through the existing, available platforms. And so the 400 million sounds like a lot of money, but for the amount of work that we have to do to improve our energy data infrastructure, our engineering capacities, and this is where I think the whole of society approach will benefit, because if we had that engineering and that cheap energy and that data resource, all the other businesses could benefit from that. All of the IP that we're developing in universities that we can't commercialise very effectively because we don't have the infrastructure for it in the UK, they could all be benefiting from this same system. And that's where I think 400 million is a woeful underspend in that area. And when you compare that to something like the nuclear deterrence of 15 billion.
Which is due to increase as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be getting bigger.
And I mean, I know, look, nuclear is a controversial topic because people are either really for it or against, even if you're going through when you're going through the paperwork to be a government representative, they ask your opinions on nuclear, don't they?
Right.
And so I get that this is
politically, it can be quite a toxic issue because if you're a politician who says, look, I don't think we should be investing in our nuclear deterrent, then you're pretty much sort of shooting yourself in the foot for any chance you might have at ever becoming prime minister. Yeah,
well, I think if you want to hold clearance, if you want to, if you want to be a prominent politician, there is such a narrative around you must be. But let's just look at it really practically. In what circumstances can you use nuclear?
The most dire circumstances imaginable.
It's pretty. I get the whole deterrence argument, but deterrence only gets you so far. And I think what it does do is if you're investing incredible amounts of resource into having just that deterrence, look at the amount of scope and freedom of movement that Russia had prior to the invasion in Ukraine. The amount of sub-threshold activity that it was able to achieve, knowing that it was way below any threshold where we would actually use that force, was incredible. And it's the sub-threshold was actually mentioned in the SDR as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point because they're all. The sub-threshold stuff, it's even sub the threshold of us using really our normal conventional means
Article
before you
5.
get to nuclear. Yeah. Anything really.
Yeah. And so even Article 5 and nuclear, these are just two things that you can do a lot to disrupt a country, to destabilise, to enforce their sort of lack of strategic advantage. Through activities that get nowhere near the point where we even use conventional weapons, let alone nuclear. So I think such a heavy investment into nuclear, and I'm not saying that nuclear isn't a threat, and I'm not sure, but I am saying that nuclear deterrence is the bit that I have issue with, because what we've seen in Ukraine is it's very difficult to stop hyper hypersonic missiles.
Yeah.
And also missiles that coming in from ultra high altitudes and things like that. Those are very, very difficult to stop, but not impossible. And I think if we did invest real resources into trying to stop those things, they are the delivery mechanisms for any payload, whether it be nuclear or otherwise. So what are we doing to really increase our capabilities around the delivery, the communication, the navigation of the command and control of these systems, rather than just deterrence? Because for me, spending 100 billion over 10 years on completely replacing our nuclear deterrence program is, in my view, a bit of an ego project. It's a bit of a vanity project to say, and maybe more for our allies than our adversaries, like, hey, look where we are in the sort of global standing of power because we have these nuclear submarines or whatever else. Where this would be way more practically useful is if we did figure out how to counter the navigation, the control, the communication, the hypersonic missiles. Really difficult to detect, really difficult to intercept. But if we did figure that out, that wouldn't only be useful for nuclear, but it would be useful for things that are actually happening right now on the battlefield.
Right.
So I think that if we put more money into that rather than deterrence, that would be a much better spend, and it would actually achieve a lot more things on the other list on the SDR, such as space, EW, etc., etc.
Yeah, because I think interestingly, I mean, Dan Jarvis has not been in his role for very long as new Secretary of Defence. But he already, I think, has come out and said he wants to focus more on the sort of short-term gains, I suppose, what is it? What are the immediate priorities for defence rather than some of the longer-term things? So I'm wondering if he's, maybe he's, going to be sort of going along the lines of what you've described there, and coming. I don't want to speculate because we haven't seen the plan yet. We don't know what's going to be in it, but perhaps, there will be something more along those lines where they shift towards the immediate focus of this is what's relevant now for the current threats we face. Yeah. Let's push back some of the other stuff, the more strategic stuff, the long-term stuff, until we're in a place where we can afford it. I don't know. I dare say. I mean,
look, I like the idea of long-term planning and thinking more than these short-term cycles that we often get trapped in. But if you were to ask Ukraine right now, what does it want? Does it want an aircraft carrier, or does it want 1,000 surface vessels, uncrewed surface vessels? I'm pretty sure it'd ask for the uncrewed surface vessels right now because it's just more practical. And something else, I think, if you were to put an aircraft carrier or a destroyer into an environment that was hostile, that was full of adversary uncrewed vessels, would you risk that aircraft carrier? Would you risk that destroyer anyway? So we're building these big platforms. Is anybody going to have the risk tolerance to put them in an environment where a £200,000 drone could render £1 billion platform inoperable? It's a big risk to take.
Yeah, that to me is almost like a no-brainer. I think they've come around to that way of thinking with this announcement that they're going to focus on hybrid vessels rather than some of the frigates that they were talking about before. So let's see what comes of that. There's been no numbers put to it yet. So
no. But it really is tricky, and I think anybody that's just doing like a very quick criticism or complaint of the fact that this is taking a while. Yes, everybody's hyper-focused on uncrewed vessels, everyone's hyper-focused on autonomous targeting and etc. But that isn't the entire picture either. And at some point you do need conventional equipment. And you were talking earlier about before we started the podcast, you were talking about how do you get kit around the world? How do you move your aircraft around if you don't have an aircraft carrier? So this is a very difficult thing to solve, and I personally don't have any issue with that taking a little bit longer. And I think we also need to measure it against, there's a lot of other threats to the UK right now that aren't conventional defence type issues. If I was to say to you that there was a force out there at the moment that could remove our politician or our political party through force, through the use of its military power, I think we'd all be pretty scared by that. We'd take that very seriously. But we do seem to live in a world where media influence or disinformation exactly can achieve that very same thing. It's hypercritical of Keir Starmer until he leaves, and now look at a lot of the narratives. I'm not saying I'm pro or against, but I'm just saying that there wasn't a lot of complimentary things said about Keir before he resigned, and now there's an awful lot of stuff about, well, actually, he achieved a lot, and it's like, oh, great. Well, why then are we so ambivalent about the communication space, the influence operations, where
when we see it can be so effective?
Yeah,
and we've seen so many multiple cases where it's been effective.
Yeah,
and
Russian envoys are literally appealing to extraterrestrial aliens to convince Keir Starmer to step down. There's all sorts of really weird stuff going on in this disinformation space where Russia is quite clearly trying to destabilise our politics. I think they were implicated by the BBC as being involved in the firebombing of his house, or the car outside his house. I think the BBC accused Russian involvement. I think there was
definitely some foreign influence there, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And you think... And this is actually something, we had a previous episode where we talked to Rachel Gilman about this kind of topic, and it's woefully underfunded. And so many of the programs that were there looking into disinformation. So, even if we were talking about that sort of sub-threshold activity, I feel like even if we're saying, well, we are legally, morally, ethically, whatever, not going to get involved in that type of, dirty war that Russia pursues. Fine, but my worry is that we're not even tracking what they're doing very effectively.
Exactly. Yeah.
We should at least be keeping an eye on. We should at least be capturing that, and we should have that as a ready pipeline for people in national security to be able to see exactly what's going on, what operations are happening against us. And I worry that we don't have that. And
I think you've touched on something quite important there, which is, it's a very contentious thing to do. If any government department is known for being involved in influence operations, it's immediately seen as a bit grubby. And I can see why, because it looks manipulative. And as a member of the public, I think it's right that we would be questioning that. But, we've danced around this idea that, are we really in peacetime? Are we in some kind of wartime footing? Where are we?
And the reason I thought of that as well was I was listening to something last week where an economist was talking about how the US is about to, I think, soon in the next couple of years, is going to hit a number for its defence budget, which is higher than it's ever had in peacetime.
Yeah. And
it was that word peacetime that got me thinking, are we really in a peacetime economy? Because it doesn't feel like we should be. And it got me thinking about multiple things. But one of them was, I think probably since you and I started our careers, have we ever really been in peace? I mean, feels like there's just been one more after another.
Yeah.
I'm probably counting the global war on terror on that, and that's a whole other can of worms that won't open. But
Russia's influence has been strong throughout my entire career, at least. All of that sub-threshold activity that we mentioned just before has been very prevalent and still is.
And this came up in our recent discussion that we had with Purple Sector, with Mark Matheson, where we talked about speed, operating at high speed. Yeah. And I think you made the point that defence is great when it's got to operate in that kind of wartime pace of operations and getting things done, getting things delivered, making things happen. In peacetime, it's when things slow down, it's not so good. That's when all the inefficiencies creep in, etc. And it made me think, okay, how do we get defence running as if we are at war?
Yeah.
And how do we get the wider economy? And how do we have that? It was something mentioned in the SDR again about having this national conversation about defence.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened. And I think that would really have underpinned the defence investment plan if they'd have come out and said, we're going to spend a lot more money on defence.
Yeah.
Everyone's on board. Everyone understands. Yes, we need to do this. It's really important.
Well, I mean, I think however we feel about the government's response to COVID at the time, one thing that I thought was quite good was that we had representatives getting on TV every day and explaining the challenges and the decisions that they were trying to make. And I know we can think of 1,000 criticisms for how it was all handled, and that's beside the point. I think one really good lesson from that period was our politicians were willing to stand up on a podium every day and say, look, this is what's going on.
Yeah.
So whether this is a wartime footing or whether this is a crisis footing, I think we can quite comfortably say that we are looking at a situation where our supply chains are massively affected. The political order is all over the place. We've got lots of threats coming from our adversaries. And so I think it would go a long way to have politicians to stand there and say, these are the decisions that we're trying to make. These are the things that we face at the moment. We were aiming, for example, for 3% by 2030 before the conflict in Iran. This is what we're now balancing that against. We do need to we do need to try and counter this foreign interference, whether it be supporting far-right groups, whether it be Russian interference into destabilising our politics. That should be called out at the very least. We have some great resources in the UK, like the BBC, and again, people will question whether that's a great resource, but what is the criticism of it? The criticism is usually about, is it really non-bias? So the criticism's about who's running it at the moment and what are their influences. But if the BBC could put itself in a situation where it was fairly definitively not biased, we've already got an organisation there that could go a long way without that necessarily being defence spending.
And something you and I have talked about before is how some of the BBC's resources, like BBC monitoring, just not well utilised in terms of not well known, really. I mean, exactly. It's used in certain circles and certain places, but it's something that should be more widely accessible to the public to help us understand more about what's going on in the rest of the world and vice versa. And, for that to be part of setting that, as objective as possible kind of information standard for, understanding for everyone to understand what's going on in the part of the world that they may be in, where they might be subject to all kinds of foreign influence. And we've seen it in so many places, and there's not really been a good answer to it, or there's not really been enough done to tackle that. And some of that may even be, I know there's some of it's not even necessarily down to people trying to politically influence others. They're jumping on a bandwagon of political content to make money. It's somebody who knows this is just clickbait, essentially.
Start a story.
I'm just going to earn loads of money off of people clicking on this completely fabricated story. And we see that happening all the time. And again, there's not being enough done to sort of really push back on that. But it's also about when we talked about defence budgets, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but the aid budget's being cut. That is not helping us when it comes to defence or national security. No. And I don't think people understand that enough. I think people think aid is essentially charity, and it's not really. It's about supporting countries to help build their own capabilities so that they can almost push back on those threats where they are.
Resolving the threat at source.
Exactly.
Yeah. And whether that's stopping disease from spreading. I mean, and this is why it's such a win-win to be involved in investing in that aid, because you look at how costly COVID was to us. Now, I'm not saying that could have been stopped by having more aid in Africa or wherever else, but the point is that we are likely preventing so many destabilizing factors by helping the rest of the world get to a state of, and look at, terrorism was a large part of everyone's career in government over the last sort of 10 to 20 years. A lot of that terrorism was enabled by destabilization in those countries, whether it be people couldn't get a job, they didn't have access to justice, education, healthcare, etc. So by providing these things, it does have a knock-on effect here at home. And I do think it's a very questionable way of finding the resource for defence by cutting those things that are essentially just potentially allowing a petri dish of other problems to come along in the not too distant future.
Corruption is the big one I'm going to throw in there as well.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
Like massive. Well, I think there's a massive opportunity to be able to use an aid budget to help tackle corruption in other countries. That is ultimately one of those causal effects or causal factors leading to some of the effects you talked about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you do tend to see that in, I saw that in a number of countries I was working in where it's not the same disincentive to engage in corruption in these countries, because you might be in a situation where you can't afford healthcare for your family, and somebody offers you a few £1 million to take a deal or to look the other way or to allow significant influence from a country that doesn't benefit us. Why is this important to defence? Is that these are our supply chains. These are also, by the way, part of the Strategic Defence Review is not just to protect the UK, but our crown dependencies, our sovereign territories,
interests overseas.
How do you get all of our resources to these places without having good relationships with these countries, etc.?
Yeah, we need allies. No one defends on their own now. And,
you can't. No.
I think that's bringing it back to some of the defence stuff, because I know we've covered a lot of territory there in a short conversation. But
the point of that, just to make that relevant, the point of saying all of that is that there are some really difficult decisions that have defence connotations, but might mean that a budget goes into someone else's department. So are we looking at maybe better funding soft power because it has a defence effect? So do we want to put that money into media, sports and media? Do we want to put that money into the FCDO?
Mm-hmm.
So if you are the Treasury and you are trying to write this dip and you're trying to get the best out of it, there might be good reason. This is incredibly complicated. And this is why I think if I was in John Healey's shoes at that time, and I know a lot of people will probably disagree with this, I would be a lot more focused on efficiencies with what I know I am getting than I would be on arguing over a 0.3% difference.
Interesting, because I think so far in this discussion, we've probably determined that we would actually spend our defence budget more creatively by reducing how much we spend on nuclear.
Well, nuclear deterrence. I think that's the important bit. Like, rather than just, I've got a bigger bomb than you.
Right, yes.
And I do think it's a bit of a ridiculous statement. We're going to let everybody get cooked by our enemy's nuclear weapon, but don't worry, we'll send one back. I would much rather we invested in stopping the missiles in the first place, having better space technologies, having better detection systems. Like, I'm not saying nuclear isn't a threat.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we don't invest in nuclear. I'm just saying rolling around the ocean with a bigger bomb than someone else seems like a really terrible, egotistical idea. And so that's that, I think that I just want to be clear about that. I'm still a fan of nuclear in the right context.
No, absolutely. But it's almost kind of, I think, what the new Defence Secretary has alluded to anyway, which is we've got to focus on the immediate priorities. Some of the more strategic things we may have to push back. Yeah. So I think we're sort of broadly aligned with that. Yeah. But then we're also saying we've got to think more creatively by looking outside of the box being defence. Yeah. And thinking about, okay, where does it fit more broadly in the system of government spending? And what else can we do to help deal with some of the threats we're facing rather than just buying more tanks or... the current obsession, everyone's obsessed with drones. And rightly so, I think, from what we've seen in Ukraine. And one of the big points from the SDR was learning lessons from Ukraine. But the SDR was a year ago. And we've already mentioned that lots happened since then. I worry that some of that focus and some of that money that's going to be spent on drones, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking back to COVID when we were desperate for PPE, and the government spent tons of money on PPE suppliers that didn't provide anything, or provided stuff that just didn't work. And I worry that if we rush to spend loads of money on drones, that we could end up in a similar situation again. I'm not pointing fingers at any particular company or any particular capability, but it's just that nagging feeling that I've got in the back of my mind where I think, are we, as much as we want to learn lessons from Ukraine, and I think the Ukrainians are doing a great job of starting to export their capabilities. We saw already the role they played in exporting some of their kit to the Middle East for the recent kind of conflict that's going on there with Iran. So they're doing a great job of getting their capabilities out there and trying to provide those lessons learned. But we've got to be thinking about, okay, well, how do we not just do this as a one-off? And again, I think this is what we talked about with Katerina, was how do you create a system that enables that more normal or run-of-the-mill innovation? Yeah. And I mean run-of-the-mill in the sense of we're doing it every day and we're doing it consistently and constantly over time, so that we are ready for whatever, to pivot to whatever the next technology or capability is that we need in defence.
But I think that is grassroots, and I think there's two ways of looking at this. If we just buy kit, we'll buy F-35s off the US. By the way, that now means you're reliant on their service and maintenance and systems. Might not be a problem, but depending on the administration, that might mean we don't have our full sovereignty. Are we going to be buying kit from Ukraine from now on because they're the specialists in drones and autonomous systems? There doesn't seem to be that looks to me like it's always going to be a cost, and it's always going to come with compromise. If we develop this grassroots infrastructure that allows us to develop our own capabilities, we've got more to export. And then maybe this thing doesn't become such a cost anyway, because we're able to export that same kit out to other people. So if we're not giving people an opportunity to innovate, develop and create our own infrastructure and industry off the back of this, if we're always just buying everyone else's technology, we'll always be behind. And to your point on, are we just looking at the problem right now and then we've got a load of PPE we don't need? I think the Middle East really exposed that issue for the autonomous systems and the drones that were coming out of Ukraine. They work well in a European environment. They don't work particularly well in the Middle East, where it's just a lot hotter, for one. And so we are
so it's just physical problems.
Yeah, these drones are the interceptor drones and all the other kit is literally melting in the heat. And if you've ever spent any more than 10 minutes in a container that's left in the sun for any length of time, those things get ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So we should be thinking at least about things like refrigeration systems. Mm-hmm. We might therefore need to think about renewable energy that keeps those refrigeration systems going for a longer period of time. We're probably going to need to start thinking about edge computing, where we're processing all of these data that's coming from the drones. What do servers emit a lot of? Heat, probably in a hot environment. And so even if they're not in a hot environment, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb on the battlefield if you have a mini data center that's just churning out megawatts of heat. Yeah. How do you then counter that so that it's not so obvious? And I think these are the challenges that are going to adapt the technology that we know is becoming more relevant to other places, other environments where we're likely to be involved in conflict next.
Chris, this has been great. I know we could talk about this for ages. We should probably wrap it up because we've only got a week to go until hopefully we'll hear something more about this defence investment plan. Any final thoughts on what you'd like to see from that plan, or what you'd like to see, not just actually within the UK, but maybe the rest of NATO or other places, how we interact with them as a result of trying to regenerate or redesign defence in a way?
I think it's not so much a desire for what I'd like to see, but I think there's another interesting challenge, which is we've said NATO first, but not NATO only. So that means we both have to stand on our own 2 feet as a sort of distinct capability, but we also have to integrate with the rest of NATO. And I think the most pragmatic way in which I can see that panning out will be that we get given an area of responsibility, and we run that ourselves because all of our kit works together and should hopefully be integrated. So that's another thing that was in the SDR, was get from joint to integrated.
A lot of integration talk.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So I think these are some big challenges. How do we integrate with ourselves first and become a standalone capability? And then how do we integrate that with a much wider NATO, which has all sorts of varieties of kit and tactics and procedures, which I know America drives some standardization through all of that, but nonetheless, it's incredibly difficult to bring all these systems together. So I think we do have to think very seriously about that. We have to think about how the challenge of integration is huge, and it's something that I think in most of my career has been the thing that has eluded defense probably the most, is how do you get one piece of data across multiple systems, across multiple security caveats, into different departments with the right role-based access, et cetera, and then how do you connect that to the equipment that's actually having an effect on the front line? I think those are all big challenges to have. The only other thing that I would really like to see is a much better effort put into our defence engagement. And what I mean by that is, let's not just go over to a country and do some basic training. In a lot of ways, it's probably becoming either tedious or patronising at this stage. That we're not we're teaching, we're rolling out the same thing over and over. We could be actually, I think, making a lot more benefit from the services that we have that aren't necessarily frontline fighters. So I actually think I saw in the SDR a criticism of the fact that so many of our military doctors are from the NHS or working in the NHS. I can't quite remember where I saw that, but I thought I see that as a real benefit. Yeah. Because if you've ever experienced a military doctor, they're excellent because they are cutting their teeth every day with real practical examples. I'd like to see that same with our engineers, with our education staff. I would like to see them heavily involved in building roads, building bridges, building things that means that when they're actually in a wartime environment, this is just really normal activity for them because they've been doing it in these countries. How can we use that to generate better engagement, better access to resources and minerals, and even just have better abilities to put our military bases into place? Because we're using our education teams, we're using our lawyers, we're using our engineers, we're getting them trained and we're keeping them sharp so that they are ready for that wartime footing. So I would also like to see, and I think that's where we can integrate the reservists, because yes, reservists are getting more and more into like these hybrid models, but there's a lot of reservists that are just getting trained to a level and then the marking time, the marching on the spot, waiting for a deployment or waiting to be plonked into a PID that's alongside the regular counterparts. Why aren't those reservists going out, building roads, building bridges,
Yeah.
getting really good and qualified at the thing
And
that
you're
they're doing?
talking about them doing this in other countries.
Yeah, I think that's what defence. To me, that's what defence engagement should be. And I'm not like I'm being very broad sweeping. There is some. I've been involved in some really excellent defence engagement programs, but I think at the moment it's a little bit of an afterthought. It's very light touch. I think we could really commit to that a lot more, and I think the output would be much higher quality soldiers and across all of our capabilities, not just at the fighting end.
A bit like a UK version of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, and this is the thing about the military, is if you look at it, it is a robust, deployable cross-section of society.
Yeah.
You've got first response, you have education, you have law, you have engineering, you have medics, you have basically a lot of Britain's services condensed into this very obviously not to the same standard, but this very robust, deployable asset that can be moved around the world. That could be generating lots of political influence and even income for us if we wanted it to. And I think that's how we could shift the dynamic of not just thinking about teeth arms and fighting capability.
That's really interesting. I think we should probably wrap it up there, because I think if we get this episode out quick enough, the Defence Secretary might listen to it before they actually push
He's got
out
some work on.
the investment plan. And some of these ideas could, we're happy for them to steal them. So
Absolutely. Please do.
Yeah, great talking to you guys always, Chris.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
Chris, it seems like it's been an age since we were in a studio talking about what we wanted to see in the Defence Investment Plan. It's now been published, and what do we think? Are you happy with what's in there, and what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I think happy is an interesting choice of words, but I think we were actually quite close. I think the Strategic Defence Review didn't lead us to any huge surprises in what I saw in the actual Defence Investment Plan. I thought what we discussed in that original recording still seems like pretty relevant, to be honest. And I didn't, having read through what I managed to read through of the Defence Investment Plan and some other people's responses, I didn't feel like there was anything in there that really threw that massively out from our original expectations.
But I think both you and I sort of discussed this, that both within the SDR and the DIP, there's a lot of ifs and buts. So there's a lot of dependencies on, all being well economically, or other budgets falling into place, and maybe talk through some of the figures, because there's a chunk of the budget that has yet to be allocated. Right, they're still waiting until the budget later in the year to sort of figure out government spending more broadly, and then they're going to find that extra bit that is not yet accounted for.
Yeah, and this is why, we talked about it in the original recording about Keir Starmer was quite clear that this is only if everything goes to plan and if the economy is in a situation where it can absorb it. And I think that ended up being a very important caveat. And so that's why I don't think it's hugely surprising that it was certainly less than the original plan, but it wasn't drastically less. So I think just some figures that I think are useful. There was already the original defence spending forecast already planned for, I think, about £9 billion increase over the next 3 years. So I think it was supposed to be 65.5 billion for 26-27, going up to 71 billion the year after, and then up to 73.5 billion after that. So if we take the baseline spend for 2025-26 at 62.2 billion, we were already planning on spending quite a bit more over the next few years. Apparently, the National Security Advisor recommended that we needed to increase that by at least 18 billion if we weren't to see significant cuts or degradations to our defence capabilities. And so if you take 18 billion, you divide that by 4 years, you're talking about an average of 4.5 billion a year extra spend that they were expecting was necessary to keep defence roughly where it is. I think the original settlement was 3.375 billion. And apparently that gap, which doesn't sound that significant to me, it's obviously huge numbers, but still, it doesn't seem big enough for that I would probably resign off the back of it. But nonetheless, both obviously John Healy and Al Carnes decided that just 3.375 billion was enough of a gap between that and 4.5 to resign. And then the new Defence Investment Plan announced 15 billion, which
so they managed to find a bit extra, I guess, compared to what
so they managed
John
to find
Healey
an
thought
extra
they were gonna
$1.5 billion.
Yeah.
So the original settlement was 13.5. We were told we needed 18, and then we got that up to 15. But remember, that's not 13.5 or 15 in total. That's 13.5 or 15 on top of the already 62.2 billion. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think we mentioned this in the original recording. When you're talking about these kind of numbers and those kind of differences in terms of percentage, I think it comes down a lot more to how you spend it than than how much you're spending, because there's so much room for creativity and efficiency, or even the opposite, spending poorly, those 750 million could very easily be absorbed in some bad procurement decisions. So I don't think the budget is as desperate as the media gives the impression, or that some politicians maybe have given the impression. So I do think that's quite interesting in itself.
Yeah, and what about sort of looking beyond the numbers, thinking about where it's actually being spent and what the priorities are as they've come out and stated in the Defence Investment Plan? I thought what was interesting was that they have, I suppose, taken more of a position that they're going to focus on the current and immediate priorities, and some of those other things that they previously had announced. So things like frigates, for example, that were going to take up a large chunk of budget. Those have been shelved, and now it's much more about the drones and other types of systems that we think there's a more urgent need for. I mean, thoughts on the sort of that? I don't want to say redirection or change of direction, because it's what was also mentioned in the SDR, but it feels like there's a bit more of a focus.
Well, I think, it seems at face value quite practical, and with all of these things, it could be proved wrong if the next conflict is very different to what we're seeing in the world right now, and the world is volatile enough that it could really throw up another big surprise. But I think if you were to ask anybody from the Ukrainian military right now, what they would prioritize, I think they would probably make very similar decisions. But we do have to be careful that we're not fighting yesterday's war, so that's an important caveat. But nonetheless, I think it seems like a fairly practical decision to focus on the closest crocodile, rather than necessarily some of the slightly bigger issues that we've had. I know that there are concerns about protecting the high north and around the Arctic, etc. Does that mean we need more frigates? I was a bit concerned about potential commitments to the Strait of Hormuz and what that would mean just militarily anyway. So if we are going to commit forces or resources into that region, what an absolute political mess that could be, if not handled very, very carefully. And B, then that might mean we need more traditional equipment, and we might have to go back to thinking about some of those longer term plans that have not necessarily been shelved, but certainly been deprioritized just to bring in some slightly more modern tech. But overall, I don't disagree with the direction they push that in. It seems relatively logical at first glance.
I think they've also, one of the details in the plan was that, for example, they've not committed to a specific number of F-35 aircraft. I think I'm right in saying that they're looking to procure where previously they'd sort of stated numbers. So I think they've given themselves some flexibility as well in terms of what defence will spend the money on. So hopefully, like you mentioned, that we're not just going to procure stuff that is needed now, but then will be out of date by the time we have to actually use it or get involved in another conflict, etc. So, hopefully they've given themselves that sort of flexibility around being able to pivot to different areas when they need to.
Yeah, and fairly famous saying in the military is no plan survives contact. And so, in the same way, and that's why I do find it slightly odd that two significant politicians would resign over this when it's not that far off the requirement, and there is plenty of room for change in the future. There is plenty of room for continued negotiations, and there's plenty of room for things to go in a wildly different direction in the not too distant future. One of the things that makes it quite hard to track all of these things is the fact that I think the increased they want to improve a lot of the housing in the area, for example. So that was a £9 billion spend, I think, over 10 years. I need to double check that. So, that is quite hard to compare to another spend which is broken over 4 years and something else which is over a different time frame. So it's not that hard to do the maths, but it's just when you're trying to read a single document and make sense of how those budgets are apportioned, it does require a little bit more thinking through because they have got a lot of different timelines associated to it. And actually, while we're talking about things like housing, retention is a really important part of getting anybody in the military, recruitment and retention.
Recruitment as well, yeah.
Yeah, and I actually think that housing is not a bad idea, but it is super expensive. If you want to try and refurbish or rebuild 40,000 homes, that does take a lot of money. But you think about how hard it is for young families to get on the property ladder, how hard it is to live in a nice quality accommodation. And so that would be a big draw, I think, into the military. Wages, I mean, I can only speak anecdotally, but when I speak to my friends that are still in the military, the wages have increased significantly certainly since I left. And so I think that is a big pull. Improving the housing is a big pull. And anybody that spent any time in military housing has either had a great experience and been in a house that they just could not afford if they were in a civilian, like an equivalent civilian job, or they are in a house that's run down, subsided, cracks in the walls, sewerage system not working properly. And so I think just to resolve that and make that a really good living experience is a big reason to stay in the military. So even though that's a lot of money, £9 billion, that could do quite a lot for recruitment and retention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they're talking about trying to attract the best talent, which they're going to need for some of the more advanced capabilities they want to acquire and deploy, etc. That's always a challenge, isn't it? I mean, when you talk about public sector recruitment versus private sector, and you're trying to get the most talented people who may be working in AI, and there's a lot mentioned in this about AI, about autonomy, about building out new technology that is going to connect together systems, digital targeting, web being the prime example. That's tricky, trying to recruit the right kind of people who come with those sorts of capabilities or the ability to grow into those sorts of roles.
Well, it's an interesting time. It's a very interesting time because, in the next, maybe a year, we may see a very big crash in the what a lot of people are describing as the AI bubble. And so, where the market is currently quite competitive, and people are thinking, well, do I work for UK government or on a UK government contract, or do I go and work for Meta or Google or whatever else? That might be a very different situation in a year's time. And there might be a lot of people with a lot of skills, a lot of talent, and a lot of resources that are now much, much cheaper than they once were. And the idea of working for a secure or slightly more secure or steady employer might be a lot more attractive. But I think on that, one of the things I did notice when I was reading through the Defence Investment Plan was they really want to encourage this innovation and bringing British businesses into this and new businesses and new ideas. And I just thought government is such an incredibly dangerous place as a customer for a lot of small businesses because you're very often dealing with delays in decisions, lots of whether it's budgets or budget decisions overrunning,
or just generally long time periods to get on contract.
It can take 18 months before you're on contract, and the amount
takes a lot
of money
of effort
and resource.
In the meantime.
Exactly. And it might not be that, the government might not be asking you specifically to spend money or deliver services, but the effort that goes into staying in that process and trying to win that contract is significant. And I think that's one of the things that they're going to need to overcome if they really want to attract small businesses. This can't be a dangerous place where you need lots and lots of runway in terms of cash flow and other things in order to survive the procurement process or the renewal process. This shouldn't be something where you need to be able to front 3 to 6 months worth of services for very expensive kit before you get payouts. So I think one of the things they need to do alongside this budget is they need to make that budget accessible, and they need to make it safe, and they need to think about it from the perspective of a small company with minimum cash flow that wouldn't take a lot for it to go out of business. And if they can find a way of accommodating that, then I think they're going to attract a lot more talent.
Yeah. And I think, we've seen the flip side of that, I suppose. As a startup, sometimes it's challenging to be able to hire people who have got the right skills and experience, but actually prefer the safety. To your point earlier, you were saying about the the safety of being in a public sector job sometimes can outweigh the other advantages of going into the private sector. So I guess there's always going to be that competition for talent, but yeah, hopefully that also translates into defence. I think taking a more realistic approach to working with smaller companies and using that. Well, I'm intrigued to see how they're going to use that innovation budget, because we mentioned it in the previous conversation that there's got to be some way to help smaller companies, either through partnerships with primes perhaps, or partnerships with bigger companies, or directly just getting them onto contracts where they don't have to jump through as many hoops maybe that they have done in the past, because that's always one of the challenges, isn't it? As a small company, you've got so much to do, admin, just from an admin perspective, to get onto contract frameworks. It's really challenging to bring, you can have some really great innovative capability that you've built, and you just want to get it to the people who want to use it. You're not necessarily focused on all the things that you need to do in the background to make that happen. And it's
a huge consideration, and it also affects the final product. When you put all of these very strict standards in place for even things like wiring, yes, there's good safety reasons for that and security reasons for that, but it can massively affect the weight and performance of the thing that you're trying to build. And if you're trying to build things lighter and lighter that can go further distances, that can carry heavier weights, then you need to find ways of saving weight, saving material, saving expense. And so I think my biggest recommendation for any defence procurement team that's using this budget, which is relatively limited compared to where a lot of the other budget is going, the innovation bit is relatively small. Mm-hmm. My advice would be brave. Don't just stick to the big primes. Don't just stick to what feels safe or like where you think is going to almost guarantee an output, even if it's mediocre. I think the idea is like expect some of this to go wrong, factor that in, but just try stuff and fail forward, fail fast. And I think if that's the whole point of innovation, it's that you expect things to go wrong, you just mitigate the impact of those things going wrong, and bake that in. Don't try and make it a perfect investment. That's not what innovation is. Innovation is about trying things and allowing a lot of those to go wrong. Exactly.
I think it's about having that comfort level with a certain type of risk that I don't think up to now defence has been very good at.
No, I think the temptation is, if you're in charge of a procurement thing for many millions of pounds, you're going to your instinct is to think, right, what company do I think has got the best chance of coming through at least slightly on this thing? Where can I minimize my risk? But if you minimize that risk too much, you also minimize the opportunity. And I think there's other places for that. There's a time and a place for that. And the innovation budget is not where that should be spent. So it's a case of looking at realistic opportunities. How can we give things a real chance to come through? And how can we make that a relatively safe environment for new businesses to come in and try stuff without us without defence putting them out of budget in the process, putting them out of business, I should say, in the process.
Yeah, and it's about having that certainty for SMEs. It's about, certainty over the fact that, when a contract's awarded, it's awarded for a longer term period, because then that gives you the bandwidth to go out and hire people, to the point we were making about recruitment, but also build the capability. It could be a hardware capability where you may need to invest in factories or whatever. And that's not a small investment. That's not an easy thing to do. If you're scaling up from, say, prototyping something to trying to get it into production, there's still that gap between some of the bigger contracts and vehicles and frameworks, etc., that are used to procure things, and some of the innovation funding, which tends to be quite short term. So I'm really hoping they're going to put some of that into longer term innovation funding to give companies the chance to have a bit more runway to get things off the ground. I mean,
well, I often think it's almost a separate,
but you know what I mean?
Well, I think it's often a very separate business that is good at getting things to like a TRL 6, TRL 7, something that's like a good working prototype, but not customer ready. That tends to be some very sort of pioneering thinkers, people that can put stuff together. It looks a bit tin and string. It's not produced in a big warehouse. It's probably in a small workshop somewhere, in a small office. There's companies that seem to really shine at doing stuff like that, but then transitioning from, say, TRL 6 through to TRL 9, that is where you tend to need a much more scaled operation. You do need to think in a very different way. And And I think we need to try and find a way of encouraging people to get stuff up to TRL6 and then say, great, we like this. Now, how do we transition that maybe to a completely different business that takes all of that working prototype and makes it customer ready, makes it scalable, and all those other things. And I think these are some of the considerations that the defence budget and the defence procurement teams should be thinking about, is rather than try and insist on one company figuring all of this out for themselves, where is the natural sort of stopping point for one and the new start point for another?
And with some of the things that they're talking about trying to do, in terms of whether it's AI, autonomy, data, sensors, electronic warfare, cyber, uncrewed systems, all of this stuff that is going to be at the potentially at the cutting edge of what they're trying to achieve. There's the temptation, I think, sometimes for them to build massive, grandiose programs around this, award that to one big prime, who then parcels out bits of it to lots of smaller companies. Whereas it might, I know that they're talking about integration and the integrated force and bringing lots of things together, but I wonder if actually they'd be better off thinking about how to break programs down a little bit into smaller elements so that those can be more easily taken on by individual companies, rather than having it all managed by one big prime that is kind of
there's just not enough budget for it. There's just not enough in that for that. Let's put it into perspective. So there's a data center that they've planned to build in Cambridgeshire. It's a 300 megawatt data center, and I think before they even put a single server in there, it's going to cost more than £3 billion. So that's a data center that is just part of the infrastructure required for all of the things that we're talking about, like AI, quantum, etc. Now, I'm not saying that we need a 300 megawatt data center before we can even begin any defense innovation, but I'm just saying these are the scales of budget required for the sorts of things that they're talking about. So if we look at that in comparison, like, I think the only option we really have is get in some small, exciting, punchy, innovative businesses, and we want to test and break and test and fail until we find something that we think is really punching above its weight, and then we want to put almost an entirely different budget behind it to scale that now, and find out and make it so that it's mass production, make it so we can get it out and export it, etc. But I think if you try and wrap all of that into this innovation budget, we've almost got no chance. So I think we need to be quite disciplined in the way that we protect that budget for the smaller, more agile test and adjust, and put it out there and get it fighting against other systems, see how it fares up against some of these multinational exercises that we take part in. Go out there and hope to break stuff until we just refine it through very fast evolution, and let's not worry about scaling yet. If we're talking about building thousands and thousands of units before we even really know if those units work properly, then we're going to waste a lot of money in the process.
Yeah, and I mean, on that note, and with that thought in mind, are you overall, largely optimistic with what you've seen, or do you think, or are you sort of racked with worry over it and thinking, actually, no, they've missed a lot of stuff here?
I think if it came down to it, and we met a existential crisis in the defence sense of the word, I think we're already probably meeting some existential crises, as we talked about before, on a number of other things to do with national security or sovereignty. But in terms of like a genuine defence threat in the more traditional sense, I think there'd be enough impetus for us to pivot towards this and find the extra budget, find the other, find the risk tolerances, etc. I think the big risk to us right now is that we just fall further and further behind on the more cutting edge side of the infrastructure, whether it's through the data centers, whether it's through developing our own sovereign AI, or at least doing that in conjunction with some of the European advances that are currently underway. So I'd say as long as we understand that we need some kind of ownership of our own infrastructure to support a lot of this, and the clusters that you talked about earlier, where we're creating an engineering and innovation space that has all the right supporting networks to achieve that. I think we'll be okay, even if we're not quite there yet. There's nothing that, like I say, if somebody gave me a budget of well over £70 billion and it was £1 billion short of what I thought it would be, I wouldn't be planning on resigning over that. I'd be planning on trying to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously seeing some political changes, Prime Minister stepping down, etc. as well. So hopefully that won't also cause more changes to this, and that the plan is now something that people can work towards, because we've waited so long for it. And we've waited to the point where I think a lot of businesses were reluctant to invest or reluctant to start programs because they didn't know whether things were going to be funded. And now it feels like, okay, actually there is a plan. We still want to see more details, but at least there's something to work towards there, and we know the general, direction of travel. Yeah. I mean, thoughts on
you mentioned the political angle there, and I do think I'm not a political expert. It's not where we comfortably sit. So this could be terribly wrong. But if I was in a fairly senior cabinet position and I knew that the Prime Minister was likely facing like almost a forced resignation, that might affect my decision whether I resign or stay in post. And what the sort of allegiances would you need to make to the potentially incoming Prime Minister? It's not unusual for entire cabinets to be removed with the Prime Minister when there's a new leader comes into place.
Yeah.
So did that affect the decision?
Least, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so did that affect the decision? I think John Healey seemed to be quite a popular politician, so it's likely he could have kept his job anyway if he decided to stay. But a week before he made that resignation, there was a strong poll to say that Andy Burnham was doing well in the by-elections. I think 2 hours before he actually submitted his resignation letter, there was another leak in the polls that suggested Andy Burnham was still doing quite well. So if you did look at this through a very political mindset of, is somebody either trying to protect their job or maybe even looking for a better job in the future and deciding who they should show allegiance to, the timings at the very least look a little bit suspicious, let's just put it that way. Now, there could be a million reasons for that. It could just be coincidental, but I think it's interesting that the 2 hours after there's a leaked result of a poll saying Andy Burnham's doing very well, the resignation letter comes in, especially over a budget which is essentially less than £1 billion different at the, from what you expected.
I mean, to be fair, they did. I think that, well, it's speculation obviously here, but maybe that resignation prompted them to find that little bit of extra funding that closed that gap a bit. Again, to your point though, maybe that was not something that you or I would resign over, but who knows? We don't know exactly what was in sort of John Healey's mind, I suppose. But yeah, I mean,
and, I don't want to take that away from them. If at the end of the day, if they got advice from their own government that said you need at least 18 billion for things not to get much worse, and then you get told you're going to have 13.5 instead of 18 over 4 years, so that breaks down to a lot less per year in terms of difference, then maybe that is enough reason to say, sorry, this isn't good enough. We don't want to put people in harm's way. But I do still think it's marginal enough to get creative rather than resign.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's that psychological element of you've worked so hard towards something, you really want it to happen, and then just at the last moment, and it's been delayed, obviously, as we know, and then at the last moment you get told, oh, actually, no, you're not quite getting all of that. In fact, we're taking a chunk out. That's probably a different psychological position to be in than the new Secretary of Defence coming in saying, okay, this is what we've got. That's fine. Can I just get a bit more extra? Coming at it with fresh eyes and maybe with a fresh perspective, it's a very different thing to, if you've worked so hard to get it to that point and then it falls short through, things outside of your control. Yeah. You're probably in a different position.
Yeah, you are. And also, we don't know how easy it is to communicate with either the Prime Minister or the Treasury. John Healey and Al Carnes might have been working really hard to try and get their message heard and just felt like they weren't being heard. So, if that in itself, regardless of the budget, might have been part of the issue. So we don't know. I just think that with all of the politics that are going on, it's hard to see this as just entirely a budget issue. And there are some things going on. There are some factors there that other people might explain away with very, very good reasons. But I do think there is an element of there's just a lot of coincidence there in terms of timings that I think some people might raise questions around that in the future. I think one of the things we can do to test that is see what happens to John Healey and possibly Al Khan's in the future. Do they land in really good jobs? Did they politically position themselves well as a result of that? And was that part of the plan from the beginning? I think they were already in pretty good jobs. So where would they go from there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think this is something we have to review as well in, maybe a year's time. Look back and say, how well is the plan coming to fruition, and give an assessment of it. What do you think?
I think the thing that I'll be watching out for is how brave they are with this innovation spending, and are they really trying to throw that money at small, young companies that are really trying to push the edge of knowledge and of capability. And if they're doing that and they're aggressively testing and failing in a positive direction, then I think they've spent that innovation budget well. If it all goes to some pretty standard primes and those primes play it safe and the procurement teams play it safe, then I think that'll be a bit of a waste and I'll be disappointed. So my main measure of success out of all of this, which is on a relatively tiny part of the entire budget, but it just, for me, it's very indicative of the mindset that we're taking into our future spend, will be, how brave they are with the way that they treat innovation and how accommodating they are to new small businesses and the infrastructure that they put in place to support that.
I'd agree with that. And I think the other thing I'm looking for is the thing that they mentioned in the plan, which is around generating this national conversation about defence. So, apparently there is some funding allocated to that as well. So I'm interested to see what that translates into, whether it's just going to be some glossy adverts, as we tend to see for recruitment or whatever, or
defence
it's going to be something more substantial.
Have generally been a bit dry, so it'd be interesting to see if they can spice that up a bit.
Yeah, so let's keep an eye out, and we will report back here on a future episode.
Yep, sounds good.
Thanks again, Chris, for joining me. It's been a great conversation.
No problem, a pleasure. Speak to you soon.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.